We are back now on the Chip Shot Football Podcast here. Again, Thursday, January 9th, just a couple days away from the start of the playoffs. And moving away from the previews just a little bit for today's show, I thought I'd look at a wider range of the playoffs a little bit and just go through the AFC side of the bracket and kind of decipher which players are the ones that are the X factors, the kind of catalyst to trying to make sure that each respected team is able to do what they want to do, right? Which player is going to be so significant that they're either going to win because of them or they're going to lose because this player was not able, to fulfill his expectations in these upcoming games. So we're going to go through each AFC team and just basically pick which player I think is the most important one for them to try and go out and get a win. And for time's sake, like I mentioned before, we're only going to go through the AFC in today's show, and then tomorrow we're going to get to the NFC. So without further ado, the first team I have on here is the Houston Texans, right? Off of that matchup, they're one of the first teams to play. And to me, the player that absolutely must make an impact in this game and has to make an impact in this game for the Texans to win, I'm going to go ahead and say it's Joe Mixon. It's Joe Mixon for me because I think the theme around these playoffs is that one of the prerequisites of these playoffs, I think, is that you have to have a very at least average running game, something that the opposing team has to respect, right? You look at the Chiefs, the Lions, the Vikings, the Chargers, all these teams, the Ravens, have a running game that you have to respect. And, the ones that kind of get whittled out are the ones that don't have that running game, right? Like maybe you start to predict like the Steelers or something like that, or maybe even the Broncos, right? So I think those are going to be huge for this game. And having Joe Mixon in his first season as a Texan this year, I think it's going to be huge for them, especially with the injuries to Stephon Diggs, Tank Dell. You need somebody else to step up, right? I'm expecting Dalton Schultz to kind of be targeted a little bit more. Nico Collins is going to do his thing. John Mechie, obviously, they're going to have to rely on him, but you need to switch it up. You need to change the pace a little bit with Joe Mixon. And he started the season on fire, and it's unfortunate that he got hurt on that hip drop tackle, I think week 3 against the Chicago Bears, and it kind of threw everything off. But in those first couple weeks, right, Joe Mixon looked like the best addition in all of the NFL, almost arguably up there with Saquon and Derrick Henry through the first 3 weeks, right? So he needs to have an imprint in this game, especially against a Chargers team where they also want to play this way, right? I mentioned that was something I wanted to see the Chargers do, go out there and really run the ball at this Texans team. So I feel like the Texans got to kind of punch back and do the same thing to them with their running back. So I think Joe Mixon's going to be huge for them. Also in the passing game, he's very capable of doing that as well. And if he has a good game, I think the Texans give themselves the best shot at winning this game at home. Again, because they're not favored. So if they want to win this game, he's going to have a big impact in it as well. Then, in that same matchup, we're just going to go down the line and look at the Chargers. I didn't know Quentin Johnson was dealing with a good amount, but he's my player that I selected for the Chargers. He's the one that I think needs to have a good game. One, because I didn't want to pick quarterbacks, because I think they're pretty easy. And we're obviously not going to talk about the number 1 seeds because they're not playing. And I didn't want to just kind of have a cop-out with Justin Herbert, so I went with Quentin Johnston because the biggest thing around him and the biggest thing around the Chargers that everybody was mentioning was that, this offense is good. It's great that they want to run the ball, and they have a very capable personnel to do that with the offensive line and J.K. Dobbins. But the thing that we lamented was the fact that they didn't have, the wide receivers that they used to, right? Keenan and Mike Williams. Obviously, they would have been great additions, but they had to let them go because of salary cap situations, right? So they had to move on from them. And now they're very fortunate that they have Ladd McConkey. Ladd McConkey's already looking like their best receiver just in terms of consistency, and you still need more, right? You can't just have one guy, especially a rookie. You can't just depend on him right away, right? Because he's already doing a lot in his first year, right? The first year for rookies is insane. So I think a guy like Quentin Johnston, who's coming off of his best career game against the Raiders, he had 13 receptions for 86 yards. He has all the physical tools to go out and give you stat lines like that, but it's been the drops and, those sort of not, I don't like saying boneheaded plays, but just those kind of weird looking plays where it just does not go well at all for Quentin Johnston. So he just had a great game for them, and if he's able to kind of get past that, get past the drops, and really contribute, he doesn't have to have 100 yards each game, but if he's able to have like 5 receptions, 6 receptions for like 70 something, 60 something yards, I think that'll go a long way for them because they really want to run the ball. And if they can get some sort of production from Quentin Johnston and Ladd McConkey, I think it's going to be great for this Chargers offense because then it almost makes it look as complete and as competitive as you would have thought in only their first year, right? They're only going to get better, but Quentin Johnston, if he could turn that corner, is going to be huge for this Chargers offense going into this year's playoffs. And then moving down the line again, we got the Baltimore Ravens. Obviously, I went with Derrick Henry because the main thing around the Ravens has been that they've always been around the top of the AFC. They were the number 1 seed last year, and they had home field advantage. And, they ended up still losing to the Kansas City Chiefs because they went away from what everybody thought was their identity, but they got a little bit too cute with it, and they tried to pass themselves out of that game rather than sticking true to the run game, having Lamar run, and using that running game a lot more than they should have, or a lot more than they actually did. So I think now when you add a guy like Derrick Henry, he has to be the difference this year, right? Because the team is virtually the same. And you add a guy, the capacity and the capabilities of Derrick Henry, he has to be the obvious difference maker, right? Or else what else did you bring him in for, right? You could say that you brought him in to, emphasize or just make better, improve the rest of the team like Lamar and the passing game, obviously, right? Because you have to worry about Derrick Henry. But that can only go so far, I believe, right? Until one team, decides to just say, forget all of that. We're going to focus on this passing game and see if you could beat us with Derrick Henry, which sounds crazy. It sounds backwards, right? But I think they have to make it like one of their personal goals each week to get him 20, 23, 24 carries at least each game and really have him make an impact in the game. Because if he's just sitting there and you end up losing one of these games, the last thing you want to do is look back on it and say, oh, we should have used Derrick Henry more. Like, that's obvious. That's obviously one of the things you have to do. So he is my player that I selected for them. And then moving on to their opponent, the Pittsburgh Steelers, I actually went with Pat Freiermuth. I went with Pat Freiermuth because instead of George Pickens, because I think without Freiermuth last week against the Bengals, they probably score 10 points, maybe less, if he's not playing. That's how bad this offense looked. And obviously, George Pickens is the main one. He's the main attraction when defenses are trying to prepare for the Steelers. But quite simply, they just need somebody else to do something to contribute in any way possible because similarly to the Chargers, right? It can't just be Ladd McConkey. It can't just be George Pickens on the Steelers. It can't just be Josh Allen on the Bills. It can't just be Cortland Sutton. It needs to be a team effort now more than ever. And, I mean, you look at the Chiefs, and they have a bunch of guys, maybe not a tier 1 A-plus receiver like they used to have, but they got a lot of guys that are contributing, which makes them so dangerous. And I think the Steelers need George Pickens in this game more than ever, especially because they don't like throwing in the middle of the field, and that's where usually tight ends operate. So the more they could use Pat Freiermuth, not only is it going to help them kind of get through each portion of the field, but also with a tight end, I think it allows the quarterbacks to get in rhythm more. So I think using him to kind of get Russ going and kind of build some sort of momentum is going to be huge for the Steelers. So Freiermuth, hopefully he can try and replicate what he did against the Bengals. And then The last matchup we have on here between the Bills and the Broncos, the player I selected for the Bills is is James Cook. I selected James Cook, and really you could have selected the entire running back room because they use like three guys or really two guys, but James Cook is the presumed starter, so I went with him because all I've heard so far about this game is how the Broncos defense matches up very well. You have to worry about Jonathan Cooper, Nick Bonito, Zach Allen, Pat Surtain on one-on-one coverage. Like the Bills could be on upset alert, right? And it is possible. Like I don't think that's crazy, but I think it's been kind of like if you're the Bills, you got to be like, all right, everyone's got to relax. Like we are the number 2 seed for a reason, and I think James Cook is going to be a huge part in kind of showing everybody why it's not just all about Josh Allen. Maybe a majority of it is, but James Cook is also someone that you have to watch out for. And the way that you kind of get those pass rushers to not come off the ball with such speed and explosiveness is kind of just running the ball at them, making them defend the run. And if they're unable to do that, then you're not in such obvious passing situations, right? You get what I mean? It's like when you're throwing the ball so much, you get yourself into 2nd and 8s, 3rd and 9s, 3rd and 7s, and things like that. So you're obviously going to pass the ball. The pass rushers know that, so they're going to know when to get off the ball and know that the quarterback is going to have the ball in his hands. But if you're running it, which I think James Cook could really do, obviously, is when you're running the ball, then you kind of move the chains. Now you're in 2nd and 4, 3rd and 1s, 3rd and 2s. It's not obvious that you're going to pass the ball. So the pass rushers are kind of holding back because they don't want to get out of their gaps and everything like that. So that's kind of how you counter the Broncos pass rush in this aspect. And also, when it comes to that secondary, because I think their secondary matches up very well against the Bills, but in that regard, make those cornerbacks come up and tackle, make them get off blocks, right? Run toss plays, run outside zones, run read options and things like that, right? Make it so James Cook is on the outside and you have to have Riley Moss go up there and tackle him. You have to have Pat Surtain come off of a block and try to tackle James Cook. All of these little things are kind of just like in a boxing reference, kind of just like body shots, right? Until you finally get a big run to break off, and it could end up being the difference in this game. So I think James Cook is going to be huge for them to kind of counter that Broncos pass rush in this game. And then lastly for the Broncos here, I have Courtland Sutton. I have Courtland Sutton because the running game is obviously important, and I don't want to, diminish that. But I think with a target like Courtland Sutton, you have to really fully use him, right? I never liked thinking that when you have a weapon like him, George Pickens, or Derrick Henry even, like I mentioned, you don't want to look back in a loss and say, oh, we should have got them the ball more, right? You got to turn every possible stone that you can. And especially against the Buffalo Bills, where physically, all their corners are 6'2 and below, while Courtland Sutton is a very much 6'4. He is an actual 6'4 wide receiver. So not only does he have the physical advantage, but also if you look back at the Bills' previous games, they're not really like a man-to-man sort of team. They like to run zone a lot, and if you remember to that Rams game, Puka Nacua killed their zone, and they run it so much because you'd like to think that they're not very comfortable in man coverage. So you got to try and take advantage of that with a guy like Courtland Sutton. And, Bo Nix, going into his first playoff game, he needs to know that he can rely on a guy like Courtland Sutton. He needs to know that he could get him the ball early and often. So, I think he needs to draw a lot of attention. And if anything at all, just draw the attention, right? Because then that'll affect everything else. And then maybe you get Marvin Mims involved or Troy Franklin and these guys. So I think Courtland Sutton has to affect the game in some sort of way, right? You just can't give him a quick look and then turn away. You got to try and get him the ball as much as possible. So all those guys that I just ran through, all those guys I think are the most important piece for each AFC team to try and get a victory in this first round, but also going forward. So we'll see how accurate I am, and we'll see how efficient those guys are this upcoming weekend. But now we're going to turn away a little bit from the playoffs and look at two other stories in the last couple segments here. One of them being the 49ers. They've made a couple moves here already with the offseason in mind. So we're going to go through them, and I'm just going to give my quick thoughts on them because they are pretty important all in all. So we'll be right back and talk a little bit more about the 49ers and this upcoming offseason.